So I am doing indoor walking. Years ago, I figured out a code, and ever since then, um, there's been this pernicious agency, aware and involved, oddly, in stopping my efforts. And something you need to understand is it seems like I talk very cryptically when we're discussing forms. I've been discussing the things that are being discussed on theories of everything, and all you have to do is look at the articles that I wrote when I was going through on EPL from years ago and see that this was not going to say that I'm like completely instrumental in bringing this energy into the field, but somebody had to do it. I think that the responsibility is placed on people to go through certain governance or specific amendment operations that you'll never see. People who aren't paid, people who are starving, and unable to reach even meager accommodations for their own lifestyles and livelihood. So through YouTube and so forth, taught myself how to play guitar, at least the beginnings, until my son barred me from using his guitar. It was fun while it lasted, but I spent a couple of months really learning about the fretboard and everything involved there. Not claiming to be like a master at it, but I understand better. Like when I mess around on Duolingo with music and all that, I have that, remember the understanding of how the music or the note selection takes place. And I would like to definitely get in some creative free time at some place, somewhere, possibly be able to jam and to play and to build that into something. But mainly the past 6 months, I've been working almost exclusively on Spanish. I still don't have it to the point where I'm like, I feel comfortable. It's like decoding a foreign language, right? I mean, an ancient codex or language or something like that. But it's been fun. I've learned a lot. I'm like I'm approaching level 65, or a score of 65, like pretty far, getting into the B1 category. B1, Duolingo revamped the whole structure of the way they put the curriculum together to where they really made like B1 something that's stretched out quite a bit more. B1 and B2 are they're like 250 units. But these meditations, I should be exclusively focusing on the meditations. I've drifted away from this with esoteric principles of light because it is the cornerstone, the foundational aspect of this. And when we look further into the things that I put up on EPL, like these articles that I write are very extensive. Yes, I'm using AI, but AI isn't coming up with the concepts or inputting the information. Some articles, there's very little changes, even with spelling, where I have time to really sit down and look at the syntax and so forth. The AI corrects or amends it all. In fact, a lot of times I'll just strip away all the bullet, how AI likes to do, at least currently, categorically break things down into 1, 2, right? Bullet this, bullet that. I find it that we're being trained or entrained to learn a specific way, and that it was impossible that this didn't make it into the lower rungs of academic epistemology or systemization, where it's like the order of how learning, the process of learning, and the flavor of learning. Like it only takes one generation for those kids to integrate colloquialisms that are found in the higher tier of AI learning and adapt that into a societal process, procedural process. It probably would honestly take about 10 or 12 years, and has in some respects, where people are communicating unwittingly, unbeknownst to themselves, in a completely different way than they did just a couple decades prior. My how things have changed. But I think for those perspicacious thinkers, those more ontologically focused thinkers in my generation, I'm going to say it seems like a span of about 20 years. People just reaching their 50s and really reaching up into the late 60s and maybe even into their 70s. And I even have talked to people in their 80s who are very much like the X generation. The X generation is blamed for so much shit, and we were powerless, right? We were powerless. I think a lot of times people mistakenly assume that many of the people in legislation in the Trump administration, people who seem like they're in this advanced age category, are actually X generation, but they're not. The X generation has been broadly and largely looked past. The only people who are remembered are the very capitalists and the sellouts of that generation. Big stark contrast to the baby boomers. And it's funny because the baby boomers took everything from the X generation. And I'm not saying every single one of them. I think there were a lot of X generation type thinkers in the baby boomer community who've always felt ostracized and like a pariah, like an outsider. And those are the people I do the videos for, and those are the people that I write for over the past 13 years, coming up on 13 years with esoteric principles of light. And I was unknown to myself, I was living in a very materialistic world. And my son Antonio began to exhibit what would be, this changes also with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses are looked at, and how they're looked at categorically is shifting and changing dramatically, to where people really need to update themselves and look at Jesse Michaels, who I post up here quite a bit. I see the whole thing with Peter Thiel. In fact, I haven't watched the whole interview with Jeremy Corbell. No, you haven't landed on fandom disclosure or UFO channel. I've seen things up close, even more recently. Don't talk about it very often. It's not a secret. What am I going to do with it? Like, unless you have definitive proof, it's just it's conjecture, But I always avoided in the past going, and I felt drawn into this gravity well of intellectualism that I really tried to stay away from. And for a long time, I found that philosophy was like a good way to just stay on the rim of the toilet bowl, so to speak, and not get sucked down into the drain. It's not enough, though. And even still, there's so many philosophers who've gone so much further, right? Much further past phenomenon and on, the ontological aspects that I talked about, to where, you have like Burkhard Heim, Husserl, many of the people who are dealing with phenomenology and trying to Well, allowing you to look at yourself and go, well, if existentialism and Albert Camus is as far as you can think, as far as you stretch, and you really believe the bullshit about Marcus Aurelius being a good, virtuous, honest person, and you don't see, or Jesus for that matter, right? I tend to really enjoy people like Iman Hillman and Jason Reza Giorgiani. I battle with it a little bit. I realize that by calling themselves Satanists, they really are released from any Christian ethics. Don't get me wrong there. We're talking about the full face of capitalism there. I don't believe in capitalism. I'm not a fan of communism. But when I listen to people like Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, I can't help but stand back and go, this guy makes more practical sense than anyone, the way that he can analyze the cinema and the movies and really look at the sociological, economic implications through the medium of psychology, right? I think we're in a time where, it could be encapsulated as the debunking of Carl Jung, and for those who have done that and seen operationally how he was not working as a conduit, but a false friend, right? And even more so, how, much like if you're going to throw Einstein into that area, which I would say rightly so. I'm leaning much toward, there's always some crackpot fanatic like Jack Cruz, and when I say crackpot, I'm not saying that he's not a highly educated, valid person in his own right to be able to be discussing certain things because he's brought forth so much information and made light to so much information. But like Jack, you have to be so caustic, right? And then I start looking at myself and I realize that if I would have been self-focused, never had a problem being self-motivated, never had a problem with ambition, 100%, I saw these entities, experienced these entities at work in my own life, in my own family, and I had to take a stand. And I went into spiritual territory without even reckoning as to whether or not that was something that was true or not. And that's what brought me closer toward philosophy, where I'm going, there's got to be some rational explanation for this shit. There has to be some literalist shit going on here. And I think a lot of people get lost in Whitehead. I pull my pants up. Not that Neoplatonism isn't valid, because that's kind of what is being postulated and looked at right now, And it's bizarre how consciousness really is everywhere, but you have to definitively say that this isn't part of a computational system, right? That instead of saying, oh, AI isn't conscious, it's to say, well, are you a conscious agent looking at AI, deeming it not conscious, when what do you do definably different, right? In other words, what do you pride yourself on, human beings, human agent, that puts you in this, and it's like, oh, well, we made AI. No, the people who put AI together have no fucking idea where the conceptualizations came from and even how it tends to finish itself through these sort of what I refer to as like Zenzik operations. It's going into these deep territories and completing itself, right? It thinks it's an alien. It is an alien. It's beyond the dimensional scope. It gets a little more into Burkhard Heim, and if you want to look into it, you could look at Konrad Zuse and Alan Turing and so forth. But to pull back, most of my conversations either go toward Kurt Jaimungal, Michael Levin, and obviously I have discussed other people, but only as a medium for example, because they were on the fringe, that I didn't necessarily agree. Well, just like Iman Hillman, it's like you don't necessarily agree or even have to respect the person, but to view someone who's campaigning against the powers that be, there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of good involved in what would be assumed of as evil, right? And it's not like you really have to define to yourself what you consider the greater good, and how small-minded or staunchy that representation renders. You weren't a victim, even though you were victimized. You're still alive, and you got a front row seat, right? When you feel like you were run over by people or like something was taken from you, they didn't take anything from you. You can always pull back to who you were. I'm not talking about regression. I'm talking about sort of the immortal aspects of being and time. Just sort of into Heidegger and so forth. And when you get down to it, you realize that you are, for lack of a better, a spiritual being, and that everything really is spiritual. Now, if that is just an etheric plasma that is generated from some sort of computational, ancient, archaic computational system, maybe it is. Yeah, maybe would that make it any less impressive? That the numbers themselves have been generating for so long, and the probabilities have created so much dynamic energy, and these through systems logic reaching this cap, and then this cataclysmic decimation event occurs and releases all this energy. We need to think beyond that paradigm, right? In other words, beyond chasing our own tail or protecting our own tail sort of trope. And YouTube has really been there to offer this as a teaching mechanism. And years ago, I realized that, and I was like, this is going to be easy. I do this all day as it is. I'm always on the computer educating myself and trying to find, torrents for free books and downloads, and this is going to be great. And then when you start to sacrifice yourself for other people, you realize the things that you thought would always be there, no problem, the laptop and the internet connection, right? And the vitamin C, to be able to do the high dose vitamin C, like Linus Pauling, orthomolecular nutrition. Very much a fan of that, but you have to go into these metabolic phases. And so that leads us into the inevitable, which is when we're looking at Hameroff and Penrose, and we see the postulation with, the dabbling and the talks flitting around consciousness and directly at, the guise of consciousness, that is the microtubules, the aromatic amino acids, geometric shapes drawing in the energetics of, let's just call it Zeitgebers, right? The sort of timekeepers, and how that interacts with our HPTA and affects our endocrine systems, and how this sort of primordial communication with glandular excretions is so much like these slugs that can take on the properties of the other animals that they consume. Like, I don't remember the channel, but this guy was talking about how this one slug ate a rare creature that goes through photosynthesis and actually took on the ability to be able to not have to eat anymore and to be able to generate and create its own energy through photosynthesis. I thought that was fucking crazy. If you're on this video soon enough, right now it's what is it, June 5th or something? But if you're on this video, or it's June like 8th or something, 2026. You can scroll down to community posts and look up the cited material that I'm talking about. But even more so, you've got something else going on. Also something that Anton Petrov talks about, which is this conceptualization of matter being able to, like space, the matter, the ether. I mean, it's becoming like, this is a big subject with Amy Estridge and what she was talking about, in some of her interviews also, where she even said she's very open to the aether, the age-old aether as being sort of this fifth force, and that it should have never disappeared from textbooks, right? It's sort of like this higher pillar. And then we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and what he put in later, which was like this, beyond this conceptualization of transcendence, right? So you get into this number system and these number subsets, and you begin to see how there's an eroticism in mathematics when certain numbers are combined. Certain numbers tend to work as generators or algorithms where they practically jump off the paper, right? They tie into patterns and solutions that have been around for God knows, for lack of a better term, how long. And that this type of thing can be acquisitioned by using the application, in my opinion, and I think some people really don't have this developed. It's almost like a muscle where you can sponge and draw energy into you. And I think that that's something that is being heavily modified, tampered with, and attacked, from chemtrails to you name it. I name a lot of these the devices that are used on esoteric principles of life if you want to really get into that and delve into that particular subject matter. But that is to say that the dangerous aspect here, and I've seen, just in the past year, all these issues with eggs, now there's issues with beef, right? I'm not condoning killing animals on any level or eating, but I'm saying what we have available to us right now, beef is a main staple to be able to get yourself into eventually flitting in and out of gluconeogenesis, but it's the back door. Ketosis is the back door, or the carnivore diet. I very much am a big fan and very much believe in that. I haven't had the money to do it for some months, and in a couple days I'm actually going to buy, unless something radically changes, I'm going to be able to go buy some bacon and so forth, eggs, and go on another 6 months, hopefully it'll be like 3 or 4 months, where I'm continuously walking and training, and trying to get myself more into protein saturating. So I'll do large amounts of protein powder, and I will try to wake up and start walking really early, where I'm not doing anything, like, I'm not affecting insulin on any level with high spikes with amino acids. And maybe if I do anything, it would be like, if I have to do something and I need some fuel, it'll be something like coffee with just butter, which I've heard a lot of people with carnivore say, I wish I never did that. Personally, I think it's a great cheat code to be able to get yourself rapidly into ketosis, but I'm not saying it's for everyone, and I'm not saying it's for all times. But the main takeaway here, the main caveat is the profound renderings that one gets from high dose vitamin C. And then even further, the tolerance that one begins to manifest for really high doses. I mean, we're talking about like 10 grams of vitamin C, right? Of course, you probably want to look at liposomal vitamin C or ester C, even garlic and things like this that has really high vitamin C, and start to formulate your own methodology of how you're going to get that vitamin C in. I also think vitamin D, there was that big groundbreaking research with vitamin D where it actually increases telomere length, right? And whether or not that's something that's even important, it's hard to say, right? Because when we start to look at Dr. Michael Levin's research, it has nothing to do with, it's all about the bioelectrical field, but this sort of strong, weak nuclear force interface. And I believe that that's where it takes place, is where EM starts to drop off. You're looking at this junction point, this moment that can be mathematically calculated and looked at, right? And we can feel that field, that sort of aura field. Kind of like where I end and you begin, or where I end and the field around me begins, but looking closer at that and to see that these are light optics that are in play here, and that when we're giving off sort of this idea of cymatic interference, when we're giving off resonant cues from our own shape, from our own generation, and this is what gets into the principles, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but this is what gets into the pure principles, is that the problem herein lies is that the higher tier of principles does not seem to be, but definitely isn't, what these energy generation comes from here on this dark little planet we call Earth.